If the British Empire was built on trade, then slavery was the hidden engine that kept that trade moving. Behind the shining ships, the exotic goods, and the promises of wealth, there was a darker truth, a human cost that stretched across oceans and generations. The system was called the triangular trade. Picture a great triangle drawn across the Atlantic Ocean. At one corner, Europe. At another, Africa. At the third, the Americas and the Caribbean. Ships did not simply sail in one direction. They moved in a cycle, carrying goods, people, and profits in a continuous flow. From England, ships left loaded with manufactured goods, textiles, guns, tools, and alcohol. These were taken to the coast of Africa. There, they were exchanged for people, men, women, and children, captured in wars, raids, or sold by rival groups. Shackled, terrified, and stripped of freedom, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. This middle leg of the triangle was the most infamous, the Middle Passage. Crammed into holds with barely room to breathe, many did not survive the
journey. Disease, malnutrition, and despair claimed countless lives. For those who did survive, there awaited plantations, fields of sugar, tobacco, and cotton, where their labor was demanded without rest, without pay, without choice. The ships then completed the triangle, sailing back to Britain carrying the fruits of this forced labor. Barrels of sugar, bales of cotton, chests of tobacco. These goods flooded English markets, feeding industries, sweetening tea, and filling the pockets of merchants and investors. It was a system efficient in design, brutal in execution. To understand the scale, consider this. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, around 12 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic as slaves. Nearly 500,000 ended up in British colonies in the Caribbean and North America. The wealth generated by their forced labor powered Britain's rise. Banks, ports, and cities grew rich. Liverpool and Bristol became major centers of the slave trade, their docks crowded with ships that carried both goods and human cargo. But statistics alone do not capture the human experience. So let us step into the shoes of one man, Olaudah Equiano. Born in what is now Nigeria, he was kidnapped as a child, sold into slavery, and transported across the Atlantic. He endured the horror of the Middle Passage, describing the stench, the chains, the cries of despair in his memoirs. After years of enslavement, Equiano eventually bought his freedom, learned to read and write, and became a powerful voice in the abolition movement. His story reminds us that behind every ledger entry, every shipment, there was a life, a person with hopes, fears, and dignity. The empire's dependence on slavery raises a question. Could it have grown without it? Some historians argue that the Industrial Revolution, often seen as Britain's great leap forward, was financed in part by profits from slavery. Cotton fed the mills of Manchester. Sugar profits funded banks and shipping companies. Even cultural life was touched by it. Grand estates, universities, and art collections were often built on the back of slave wealth. Yet within Britain itself, views on slavery were divided. Many accepted it as normal, even necessary. Others began to question its morality. The Quakers, a religious group, were among the first to openly oppose it. By the late 18th century, abolitionist voices grew louder. William Wilberforce in Parliament, campaigners like Thomas Clarkson, and societies that collected petitions against the trade. They were joined by the testimonies of freed slaves like Equiano and Ottobah Cugoano, who gave a human face to the suffering hidden behind economic gain. Still, resistance came not only from Europe, but from the enslaved themselves. Across the Caribbean, rebellions broke out. In Jamaica, Barbados, and other colonies, enslaved Africans fought for freedom. The most famous was in Saint-Domingue, where enslaved people rose up under leaders like Toussaint Louverture, eventually creating the independent nation of Haiti. Though not a British colony, the Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves across the empire, proving that even the most oppressed could fight back. The triangular trade also shaped culture in unexpected ways. Foods like sugar, rum, and coffee became central to British life. Tea with sugar became a daily ritual, a symbol of refinement, yet each spoonful carried with it the hidden labor of enslaved hands. The Caribbean, meanwhile, became a melting pot of African, European, and indigenous traditions, blending into new languages, religions, and identities. By the end of the 18th century, pressure to end the slave trade reached its peak. Campaigners filled newspapers with images of chained Africans, urging readers to see the trade for what it was, a crime against humanity. After decades of struggle, Britain officially abolished the slave trade in 1807, but slavery itself continued in British colonies until 1833, when emancipation was declared. Even then, the freed were often forced into exploitative labor contracts, and former slave owners were compensated with millions of pounds, while the formerly enslaved received nothing. The legacy of this period is complex. On one hand, the profits from slavery helped Britain build its empire, fueling trade, industry, and expansion. On the other, it left scars that are still felt today, in the Caribbean, in Africa, and in the very fabric of British society. The triangular trade was not just an economic system. It was a web of human suffering and resilience, shaping cultures and histories across 3 continents. As we move forward in our story, we must remember this. The empire was not built only by the decisions of kings or the ambitions of merchants. It was also built on the backs of millions who never chose to be part of it, but whose labor and lives became its foundation.